Hello, everybody. This is Dan Eisenberg, and this is number 28. Yes, episode 28 of Scale Up Podcasts. I'm just willing to bet that you all were taking bets that I wouldn't get to 28, but we did. And we've had some wonderful conversations here. As you all know, Scale Up Podcasts, it's a serious hobby of mine because I'm curious about how we unravel the process of growing company. Unravel and I guess re-ravel the process of growing companies. That's something that individual entrepreneurs need to do, investors want them to do, society wants them to do. So let's try and figure it out. And luckily, we have a huge variety of companies here on Scale Up Podcasts, and today's no exception to of a company that probably no one or very few people have heard the name of, but it's quite ubiquitous. Maybe that's a tiny exaggeration, but it is present in a lot of things that we see and do. And it's a company called Raspberry Pi, P-I, not P-I-E. And this was founded by a co-founder, I should say, who's by the CEO, current CEO, Eben Upton. So Eben, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
Good to hear your voice. You can hear the British accent. And that's where he's based. Raspberry Pi is a public company, and we're off. So, but Eben, just before we sort of as a start to get going, because people don't know you, and maybe a lot of people do, but certainly I didn't before this. But why don't you say a little bit about yourself, and don't say anything about Raspberry Pi yet.
Okay, I'm a middle-aged guy. I'm a child of the 1980s, and I have been an engineer. So I'm 47 years old, and I've been an engineer probably for almost exactly 40 years. And in becoming an engineer, I benefited from having a childhood full of equipment I could tinker with, and in particular, I guess as a very young child, Lego that I could tinker with, and then as a slightly older child, computer hardware that I could tinker with.
And 80s and 90s where this was just dawning on the world, right?
That's right. And there was a strange era, and I think so much of everything is contingent, I suppose. It's accidental and contingent. And we went through a period of time where the cheapest thing that you could build that a child could use to play a computer game or to edit their schoolwork was a general purpose computer, was a fully functional general purpose computer. And this led to a proliferation of machines. I had a machine called a BBC microcomputer. It's a peculiarly British machine, but I know obviously American listeners may have had Apple IIs or TRS-80s or
Trash.
I guess Commodore trash 80s, right? And I guess the Commodore 64 is probably the only one that really spans both the American and European home computing and Australian home computing traditions. And these machines all have the same feel, right? You turn them on, they go beep, and they give you a programming prompt, right? And they lure you, even if you bought them to play games on, or you bought them to do, or they were bought for you to do your schoolwork on, they lure you into becoming a computer programmer. And that's how I became an engineer.
Yeah, you got hooked early on. No football, i.e. soccer, more computers, or all the above.
Yeah, I mean a little bit of. I grew up in Yorkshire, so I live in Cambridge now. And if you've ever been to Cambridge, it is a remorselessly flat landscape. Certainly, the bit of Cambridgeshire I'm in is remorselessly flat. But I grew up in Yorkshire, which has what pass for hills in the UK, and so I was a mountain biker and a rock climber, and occasionally a runner. But yeah, all of the time when I wasn't doing those things, I guess I went fairly smoothly from Lego to computer programming as my engineering fix.
Fast forward, I think you did a PhD at a little known university in Cambridge.
Yeah, we have a little spin-off from Oxford University here that's been around for a little while. I rocked up in Cambridge in 1996. I was surrounded by people who had to study computer science. Well, to study physics originally, but I studied physics and electrical engineering and then computer science. And then I did an MBA for my sins, did an MBA. But when I was doing computer science, I was surrounded by people who had the same introduction to computing that I had. This isn't the subject. It's a subject that we are now beginning to understand how to teach in schools and beginning to kind of understand the importance of teaching it in schools. But it's never really been something which has been taught well in the formal education system. And so to the extent that you meet somebody at the University of Cambridge when you're 18 years old and they are excited about computers, it's overwhelmingly likely that that excitement has come from some sort of informal involvement with computers rather than because they had an inspirational teacher at school.
Okay, so let's fast forward and now tell us about Raspberry Pi, what it is today, and don't say anything about Eben Upton.
Well, it's a wonderful story that we get. The early exposure to computers generates computer programmers and generates engineers. But there's a corollary, which is if you take the computers away, then the engineers go away. And this is something that happened. This is something that happened in the 1990s, right? That historical contingency, the moment when general purpose computers were the object you put in children's rooms to play computer games on, in particular, went away really quite quickly. And there was a couple of generations where people would own games consoles, and games consoles are hugely powerful pieces of hardware. Even a 1990s games console, an original PlayStation or something, or even a Super Nintendo or a Sega Genesis, localizing that into American, that's what we called a Mega Drive. When I was a child, those are awesomely powerful pieces of hardware, but they aren't programmable. And in fact, they're not. It's not just that they are accidentally non-programmable; they are non-programmable by design.
It's the business.
It's a business. It's a business model of those, right? You're giving away hardware, you're subsidizing hardware, and you're recovering your losses by monopolizing the software ecosystem. So you go from a world of programmable hardware to a world of non-programmable hardware, and then a delayed action consequence of that change is a collapse in the number of young people studying computing. And I almost talked about myself, but so let's talk about the university. The university saw a decline, a very steep decline in the first decade of the century, from about 600 or 700 applicants a year for 100 places, good Cambridge oversubscription ratio, down to kind of a 2-to-1 ratio, kind of 200 applications.
So the driver of Raspberry Pi, which we'll get to, is first of all what's happening at the universities.
That's right. So, and it's a hypothesis test, and we still do describe Raspberry Pi's interaction with education as a hypothesis test. If the hypothesis is that if the removal of programmable hardware made the students go away, then if you bring programmable hardware back, then the students come back. And that was what Raspberry Pi has always existed to do. It's always
explain what is it? Because what is it?
Yeah, so Raspberry Pi has its origins in a desire to build that missing piece of programmable hardware. A piece of hardware that is performant, that is physically robust, that is programmable, and which is cheap enough. If you're going to ask children to buy something in order to engage with your subject, it has to cost the same as a textbook. We had this idea that, $25-$35.
This is for children. It's your first target user are children.
That's right. So yeah, and obviously we've been on this incredible journey since. But when we were looking at this in 2008, when we were staring, this is Alan Turing's university, right? This is if the University of Cambridge is having trouble finding young people who want to study computing, then every university is going to be having this problem. And so you start off thinking, what can we build that is programmable, that fills that niche which is now empty in children's lives? And if we get units into the hands of at the tiny scale, if we make 1,000 of these things and we put them in the hands of the right 1,000 children, and 1/10 of them get excited and apply to Cambridge, well, that's a 50% improvement. We've gone from 200 to 300 applicants. That's the scale, incredibly parochial and very Cambridge-centric, very education-centric initial mission for the organization.
So how'd you get it going? Because you're now a $250 million company. It doesn't sound like a couple hundred applicants to Cambridge University.
Yeah. I think this is one of these, Raspberry Pi. So the object that we built is about the size of a credit card. It has, if you go around the edge of it, you see USB connectors, you see Ethernet connectors, you see HDMI, you see SD card to store the file system for the device. So you see these very kind of standards-based connectors around the side of a little green board that has in the middle of it some memory and some logic. Some memory and some logic.
A teensy green board, like a
Yeah, really small.
cigarette package, even smaller.
Yeah, that's right. So this kind of little object. Yes, I tend to describe it as a credit card size. My CFO, who's more literal minded, does prefer to describe it as a cigarette packet size because it's thick. Obviously, it's not thin like a credit card. It's about half an inch thick because of the height of the connectors. And you plug this into your television. You plug a mouse and keyboard into it, and you've got a PC. It's not a particularly, at that point, not a particularly high performance PC, but it'll boot a desktop and it'll run programming tools. And you build this object. You put it in the market we put it in the market in 2012. And we sold 100,000 Raspberry Pis on the first day.
It's a lot.
Took orders, right? That's a lot.
Who were the buyers?
Well, that's the fascinating thing. Not children, right? Yeah, well, sort of adult, technically literate hobbyists, geeks, people who were already had some understanding of computers, some passion for computers, and that this was an object that they could use to express an existing passion and existing enthusiasm for computing, and something which would fit into the middle of some project they were building and let them do something they couldn't do before.
So I just want to sort of pause and make sure everyone understands that this is a cigarette package size computer, fully functional, without the peripherals, right? But ports for all the peripherals that you need, and costing $35.
That's right. So the first object that we launched cost $35. And we went through this interesting journey that we stood up in, one of my co-founders and I did an interview with a journalist, Rory Jones, BBC technology correspondent, in May of 2011, and said, we're going to do this thing. We're very much with the education focus. We said we're going to do this thing, and Rory said, I'll write about this on my blog. And we had 600 in 2 days. We had 600,000 views of the video. This very simple 45-second clip of my co-founder holding up a non-functional sample of the device and just talking about what we were trying to accomplish.
So what itch? So could you try and define a little bit better? Or broadly, what is the itch that this is scratching at that stage? Because it's not exactly the educational itch.
Yeah. I think it is a desire for a piece of Lego, a piece of glue that sits in the middle of a project and connects peripherals and networking and storage and some compute, at the time a pretty limited amount of compute, and lets you accomplish some project which requires a little bit of intelligence, a little bit of glue in the middle of it.
For example, give us an example, like creating a game? Or?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's interesting. That's one of these sort of unintended consequences, I guess. That when I had my BBC microcomputer, I was a child. How did I become an engineer? I became an engineer because I wrote computer games, and that was what I was passionate about. I was passionate about software. I became a silicon engineer later in my professional career, but I started off as a software engineer. And so my vision for what children would do with this object is that they would do software engineering, and particularly they'd write computer games. In practice, this thing has physical interfacing capabilities. And so the most interesting things that people have always done with Raspberry Pi, and certainly the things that people were doing with Raspberry Pi early on, were physical interfacing. Give you an example from a couple of years into the project. A Japanese engineer whose parents ran a cucumber farm, right? And they're getting on in years, sorting cucumbers. Japanese cucumbers, apparently you sort them into 23 buckets, depending on how straight they are and how spiny they are and what color they are. And so he trained a machine vision model to watch these things through a camera, because we have a camera interface on the board, watch these things as they came down a conveyor belt on the camera, and little flappers to flip them into buckets, and a little web interface to allow his parents to see how the sorting process was progressing. And it seems kind of silly, right? But it's actually quite a nice little example of, without something like Raspberry Pi, you can have that idea, but you need to have something that has that essential quantum of interfacing, processing, storage, and networking. That times in the hobbyist community where we started, that times 1 million. That's our market. In the industrial and embedded market, we'll talk about that in a little bit. That really is a kind of a toy model of what large industrial OEMs now do with Raspberry Pi at scale.
So let's fast forward. Now you're a quarter billion with a billion-dollar company, publicly traded. Connect the dots. How do you get from here to there, and what were some of the challenges along the way?
Well, if it was a surprise to us that enthusiasts embraced the product so quickly early on, I think the other huge market surprise for us is how many of those enthusiasts then took Raspberry Pi with them into their professional lives. Because many of these people, if you're excited about computing, if you're an adult, you're excited about computing, there's a very good chance that you work in the engineering industry. And there's a very good chance that if you've got excited about this object in your personal life, then the next time your boss challenges you to solve a problem in your professional life, you've got to reach for the tools. We are not the first company to ride this road from enthusiasm to success in professional embedded. And really what happened over the first 6 or 7 years of the business is very rapid sales growth from kind of 1 million units in that first year to sort of 6 or 7 million units a year when we were 6 or 7 years into the project.
Right. I mean, right. Let's pause right there. So, what was driving that six-fold growth? Was it the enthusiast market, or did something change?
Yeah, the thing that changed was that while we remained very strong, the enthusiast market remains extremely important to us. It's now maybe 10 or 20% of our business. And it remains incredibly important to us. And you could sort of say, along with the education market, is where the heart of the business is. But in terms of where the mass of the business is, the volume of the business is in this industrial and embedded world. People either, talk about industrial and embedded. So industrial, people taking our products and using them in an industrial environment. So using them to automate a factory, using them to automate production test, using them as a prototyping platform. Or more significantly these days, embedded. So it's effectively OEMs embedding our product into their product. So if you are you're an elevator company, and you want to want to make a new model of elevator that has a screen inside the elevator car that you can interact with. You shouldn't have to be. You're a great elevator company. You should not have to become a computer company in order to provide that interactivity and intelligence in your product. You should be able to outsource the computing, the intelligence element of the platform, and we tend to be the place they outsource it to.
Yeah. So are you saying that this $35 product actually it wasn't just a cheaper version of something else? It was actually doing something in a way that no other product was doing, at least not for those customers.
Yeah, I think that's right. That it is where probably I conceived of it as being a cheaper version of something else, a lower cost alternative to a PC or a Mac. In practice, I think because of the interfacing capabilities that we built into the platform, which are largely missing from pure play, a desktop computer, desktop or laptop computer hardware, it became something else. And this is really one of these examples. And I guess, sometimes there's a huge parameter space of possible products you can build. And I think the iPad is often held up as being another one of these products that you can't focus group into existence, that you kind of, so in that parameter space, there are products and there are people buying products, but there are also pools of undetected latent demand that occasionally you'll drop a product in and you couldn't really focus group it into existence. You just have to put it into the market and then you discover that there is demand there. And that's, 100,000 units in the first day, 1 million in the first year. That's the sort of demand growth that you see when you accidentally drop a product in to an empty bit, a little bit of blue ocean that nobody knew was full of demand.
And to be clear, by today, as I understand it, about 60 million units sold altogether. So it didn't stop.
Yeah, north of 70 now. So these numbers are any Raspberry Pi number that you write down becomes stale by the time you talk about it.
So I stopped you at 6 million, but let's go forward to the $250 million. So let's talk about the growth of from, it catches on. You've got a product there. You've somehow tapped into a demand that you didn't quite anticipate. You've got in a way, maybe a tiger by the tail. How do you parlay that into a company, a public company,
Yeah.
not trivial, out there doing $250 million of revenues?
Yeah. So if we talk about how do we scale early on, and we had some very specific challenges early in our scaling journey,
Okay.
in that the organization that we had produced, the organization we had created to solve this problem was a charity, was a not-for-profit, was a UK registered charity. And the organization that I have been involved in running for most of the last, for the last decade and a half was originally called Raspberry Pi Trading Limited, then Raspberry Pi Limited, now Raspberry Pi PLC, the trading subsidiary of the foundation. And the interesting thing about that setup is it isn't obvious how to bring external risk capital into that business. Once you've detected this demand signal from the market and you have a product that you think has good product market fit and addresses that demand, normally you would expect to be able to articulate an investment case and bring risk capital into the business. But the charitable nature of it, obviously you can't bring risk capital into the charity, and it wasn't even really initially obvious how we could bring risk capital into a subsidiary of a charity.
Because the charity may have different vision. The charity may not want to make money. It may be satisfied with, and investors, of course, they want to make money.
Yeah, that's it. And so it wasn't obvious that this was going to be, that it was going to be feasible to follow that traditional growth
So
route.
how did that work out?
And well, what we ended up doing, so we're based in Cambridge, and there's another very successful company that came out of Cambridge, and that's Arm. And in fact, interestingly, Arm are the descendant of Acorn Computers, who manufactured the BBC microcomputer of my youth. And while Acorn disappeared, this the collapse of Acorn, this one little neutrino emerged, which became the Arm, the $100 billion Arm.
It's a chip maker, a semiconductor manufacturer.
It's more intriguing than a semiconductor manufacturer. It's a licensor of semiconductor IP. The distinctive thing about Arm is that they don't make chips, or they don't commission the making of chips. They design pieces of IP and they license that IP to other people who then incorporate them into chips and pay Arm a royalty. And we took a leaf out of their book. So for the first 5 or 6 years of Raspberry Pi's life, we actually had that shape. We were a licensor of technical IP and a licensor of brand IP. So we would develop the technical design of the hardware. We'd develop the software that ran on the hardware. We would obviously maintain the brand and all of that kind of community collateral around the technical platform, and we would license the use of those assets to 2 licensees who would have the products made and pay us a royalty. And the wonderful thing about that, from our point of view as an organization which didn't feel that it could raise external capital, is that you're outside the working capital flywheel. You're outside the working capital loop. So the business can expand rapidly, and you're on the side of it, tapping off a royalty stream from the business. And that was really the thing that powered us. That gave us, because our licensee partners were large global scale corporations. It meant that we had a global footprint. We've never wanted to be a big British computer company. We've wanted to be a big computer company.
What changed? What changed?
What changed? What do you mean? What changed?
Well, you say the business model was a licensing business model,
yes.
but now you're an more integrated manufacturer, right? So
indeed. So licensing is a great business in lots of ways. So it's capital light, and as I say, your licensees provide you with a global footprint, and a global footprint from day one. So you could buy a Raspberry Pi in South Africa on the 29th of February 2012 when we launched it. You could buy it in South Africa. You could buy it in Taiwan. You could buy it in North America. But the challenge, of course, is that it is not the unit economics of licensing are not especially compelling. So you find yourself giving up a substantial fraction, well, the majority, if not the vast majority, of the margin in each unit that is claimed by the licensee, not by the licensor. And gradually over time for a variety of reasons, not really initially in search of better unit economics, we started to develop a capability inside the organization to have products manufactured and to sell them in a more conventional way.
And that way
So
you escaped the ARM model,
that's right.
or had served its usefulness,
Yeah.
but
And
now
it's
you
still, yeah, that's right. And so for some of our products, it remains our primary way of monetizing the IP. So the more modern and high density, generally the higher ASP products. If you think we started off with, our products today range in price. Our computing products today range in price from $4 for the cheapest object to well over $100 for the fastest, most memory-rich product. And generally,
still isn't crazy. It still isn't.
it still isn't crazy, right? The very most expensive thing we make is a product called Raspberry Pi 500 Plus, which is a computer embedded inside a keyboard in the same way that my BBC Micro or a Trash 80 or a Commodore 64 was a computer inside a keyboard, that classic home computer format. That is the most expensive object we make. It costs $200. It has 16 gigabytes of RAM. It has a quad-core 64-bit processor. It has a lovely mechanical keyboard and LEDs. And we actually operate a retail store retail store in Cambridge. And after we've been selling this, and it's on the second floor, the second story of a mall in the middle of Cambridge, and on the ground, and on the floor below us, on the opposite side of the aisle, is the other fruit company the American fruit company. They have a store as well. I looked at the feedback after the first month of selling Raspberry Pi 500 Plus in the store, and the number one piece of feedback was, "It's too expensive. Why is it so expensive?" So it made me laugh because it has there's $200. The other fruit company will charge you $200 to upgrade your MacBook from 16 gig to 24 gig. So we give you twice as much memory, and we throw in a free computer along with it as well. But you still, of course, you get a reputation for making things which are cost effective, and if you make things which are a little bit more expensive, people do wonder what you're up to.
So let's talk a little bit about the organization. You're growing, and you've figured out a way of capturing more of the value. You've figured out how to get into the market. What are some of the organizational challenges and the things that you've learned you didn't use the word geek, but a computer, whatever.
Yes, the adult technically illiterate enthusiast. Yes, I am. I'm a geek. I'm a geek.
So how'd you get to be a CEO of a $250 million company? What was the same you learned along the way? That's not what we learn.
Yeah. Same way I became it's exactly the same way I became an engineer, accidentally one day at a time. And what have been the challenges? I think we're unusual in that we have a completely relentless focus on talent in the organization and on making the organization an enjoyable place to work. Right?
Say more.
Yeah, we have exceptional people, and we hire, we acquire, and we retain. We have almost 100% retention rate across the organization, and certainly in the engineering function for years and years and years on end. Basically, nobody leaves. And I think that what we've done is we built an organization which gives engineers have a choice. They can work for little startups, or they can work for big corporations. And little startups are great because you have a lot of autonomy, you have a lot of flexibility, you're able to direct yourself often. But they are often problematic because you really don't know where the next paycheck is going to come from. They are,
and a lot do fail. Yeah.
Yeah, they can. They are. It's a numbers game. And large corporations are amazing too. And I've spent time working in large corporations, and they have access to enormous amounts of resource that can be deployed. But the way in which those organizations make decisions about how to deploy those resources is often extremely bureaucratic and painful. And really what we've tried to do in building this organization, I think the thing that makes Raspberry Pi distinctive as it has scaled, is we've tried to, as we've acquired more resources, and we can now do amazing things inside this organization, we've tried to retain that startup-like level of flexibility and that startup-like level of, and we're really, really serious about this. I think a lot of people talk this talk, but we do try and walk the walk, right? We try to retain that.
How many people
About
work?
140, go to about 140 people now, right? And the interesting thing there, of course, is we have about 80 or 90 in the engineering function. And the interesting thing there, of course, is that because a lot of that engineering investment is pointed forwards towards future products,
Ah,
you are the products that you can actually see, the things that have actually launched, were probably developed by half of that team. Half of that team we've grown quite quickly. Half of that team have never touched a product which has launched yet. They're working on things for the future.
so who actually makes these widgets? You've got a big engineering staff. Who's making the product?
Like a lot of other manufacturers, we outsource that. And we're very lucky because we build almost all of our product. We've been able to build almost all of our products in the UK since very, very early in our trajectory. And they're built for us by Sony in South Wales as a piece of contract work. It's quite unusual, I think, to use Sony. Sony have some amazing manufacturing capabilities. It's fairly rare that a third party gets access to those capabilities, but we were very lucky from 2012 onwards, not quite from the start of the organization. The first million Raspberry Pis were built in China. I think that's people's assumption that any product as cost effective as Raspberry Pi will end up having been built in China. We've been able to build our products in the UK.
That's amazing. So, and so Sony basically chose you or allowed you to be their customer for some reason, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the factory that builds Raspberry Pi was a television factory. The fun thing about CRT televisions is that they are volumetrically incredibly inefficient, right? They're a big box of vacuum. And what that tends to lead to, the manufacturing structure that leads to, is television companies having a television factory in every country because you want to build them near to where your customers are. And then when you move to flat panel televisions, of course, they're volumetrically much more efficient. And so the calculus about where you build these devices changes. The manufacturing tends to migrate to lower labor cost economies, and you tend to put them in shipping containers and ship them to where the customers are. And the factory that we build our products in lost out on the television business during that transition. It does still build product for Sony. It actually builds broadcast cameras. Very interesting setup there. That you have a production line which is producing Raspberry Pis at a rate of up to 40,000 units a day, alongside a production line which might be building 2 high definition broadcast cameras a day. You have a production line facility and you have a cell assembly facility right next to each other. The monetary value of the things coming out of those 2 production lines is actually fairly similar, but distributed very differently.
So, so have there been any challenges that you've experienced in terms of building and managing the organization, despite the fact that it's 100 and some very satisfied, let's say happier engineers?
I think there is always some part of the business that requires, and at 140 people, I think fairly famously, we're about to go through some challenges, right? That there is this moment in a company's history where you pass the Dunbar limit, which is kind of roughly in the 150 person range. So I think there are probably challenges that are just some joyous challenges that are about to occur to us over the next couple of years. But I think my experience along the way has been that there will always be some part of the organization which has insufficient hierarchy. Because you're trying to build a flat organization and an organization where the people who are the leaf nodes in the organization still have a lot of autonomy, but that doesn't mean that the correct structure is not for me to have 139 direct reports, right? And I've been very, very lucky. I have a very, very capable executive committee in the organization. I have 5 or 6 people working directly for me who do amazing work, but also the right structure is not for each of them to have 30 or 40 direct reports. And we always tend to, because of that focus on empowerment or autonomy, we always probably delay the introduction of hierarchy into the organization until things are really squeaking. And on any given day, and I know which bit of the organization it is right now, on any given day, there will be a little bit of the organization where you can really feel the need for the introduction of a little more process and a little more formality. And we just kind of have learned over the years to recognize that and do it not too soon, but not to leave it until it's too late. Because if you leave it until it's too late, you're actually, in the name of preserving that autonomy, you actually and preserving the quality of the working environment, you actually end up degrading the working environment, not just for the management, but also for the for the people doing the actual work.
So a lot of people who actually grown companies say they've either done that too soon or done it too late. Did you get it
And
just right, or
I
would
think we probably don't know. I think that my the closest I've come to doing it just right is to do it an equal amount of is to do it too early and too late an equal amount of the time. I think you can box it. I'm not sure I've ever done it on exactly the right day.
So what would you tell if you, let's say, ran into your younger self, 20 years younger, wanting to do something crazy like this? What kind of conversation would you have?
Um, I I think I would. Well, there's a couple of things. I think that quite often I try to imagine having that conversation, but with a view to getting advice from my younger self rather than giving advice to my younger self. I give a kind of an example, just to retain the joy in what it is that I'm actually able to do. You know, because there are aspects of the job which are stressful, time consuming, which I probably, which in the moment you could think, why am I doing this thing? The travel is a really good example, actually. I spend a lot of time on aeroplanes. I do a little less now than I used to because I have young children. But I do spend a lot of time on aeroplanes. And when you're dragging yourself off a 10-hour flight, reminding yourself of how excited your 20-year-old self would have been, that a big part of their job is to go and sit on an airplane and go to see the world at somebody else's expense it's a good reminder and a good tonic when you're feeling a little bit jet lagged. So there are some of those things. I mean, what advice I think, and I've always tried to, and I don't live up to this, to figure out and do today what I'm going to wish in a year's time I'd done a year ago. And I think but despite that orientation, I've still done a lot of things too late.
You said organization might be one of them. What were some of the others?
Yeah, probably the kind of initiating the technology. Yeah, we've done some really gutsy engineering programs, particularly doing silicon in-house. One of the things that makes us unusual, particularly for we're still a relatively small organization in terms of headcount, is what we build. We don't just build electronic products and write software that runs on them. We build a lot of the silicon devices, or design a lot of the silicon devices that power those products, right? And that was and we started doing that, quite a long time ago. And it was quite a big bet in the organization. And at the time, it felt like a really, really big bet in the organization. But it is the thing which is really the last 5 years of change in the organization. Interesting thing, we're known as an electronic products company. In the first half of this year, we actually sold more chips than we sold electronic products. So if you had a Raspberry Pi experience in the first half of this year, it was more likely to be a semiconductor experience than an electronic products experience, right? And that change in the organization was, we could have done this sooner. It's a great example of something where it was such an intimidating decision because chip design, I've been involved in chip design for a long time. Chip design are these very big binary bets where you do a bunch of work. You don't really know if you're even going to be able to design the chip. You design the chip, you think you got it right, you tape it out, you send it off to the foundry to be manufactured, and then you get it back 3-4 months later, and maybe it's a diode, maybe it works, maybe it's a diode, maybe it's a resistor. I had one come back once which was a 0 ohm link, which was a solid power to ground short. You really did plug it in and it got very hot and the smoke came out. And so you have these things, they feel very intimidating, but they power they power the change as you do these things which really stretch the organization. They drive capability acquisition in the organization. They turn the organization into progressive. We've been a lot of different things over the years, a technology licensor, an electronics product manufacturer, a semiconductor company. And the thing that defines what you are this year is the set of capabilities you've built. And the set of capabilities you build is really the kind of the record of the history of all of the things that you've tried to do. And I've always felt I've never regretted growing a capability in the organization. And so probably the advice to my younger self would be to try and not, not just in the hierarchy building the organization, but the things you try and do the thing 6 months sooner than the very earliest moment that you think it would be prudent to do it.
In a way, it's not exactly, but it's sort of like if you build it, they will come. Develop the capacity and
Yeah.
as part of the process, but don't wait.
Yeah. Don't wait, and just, if you're going to do it, if you think you're probably going to do it at some point, well, why not do it now? If you can do it, if without jeopardizing what are you going to not do? You're going to not stretch your neck out so far you get your head chopped
So,
off, right?
so
So
let's
you got to
so let-
risk the organization. But if you can acquire a capability without jeopardizing the organization that's doing the acquisition, well, you probably should.
so let's talk a little bit about AI, because this kind of is a natural segue. It's something that is exciting to a lot of people. It's frightening to others. It's puzzling to everyone else. How is that fitting into your future, do you think?
Well, the example I gave earlier, the cucumber example, is an AI example. And I think it's interesting that the sorts of things that people have been doing with Raspberry Pis right since 2012 have had an artificial intelligence. What is the edge AI, right? It's about making decisions at the edge of the network, right? It's about devolving autonomy in systems to the edge of the network and allowing those devices to respond to the world around them, make decisions, classify the data that they're receiving from the world around them. So I think there's always, and from year to year, the mechanisms that people use to make those decisions will change. And probably early in Raspberry Pi's history, there was very definitely a sort of a classical machine vision, hard-coded expert systems kind of feel to the way that people made decisions about the world. These days, there is more of a neural feel to the algorithms that people are using to make decisions. But it's all really the same thing, right? It's all about we always say it's about doing maths, AI is just maths, right? It's about doing maths at the edge of the network. And so I think that underlying trend and the fact that as these algorithms evolve, they tend to consume more computing power, and as our products evolve, they tend to provide more computing power. I think that it has been a tailwind. It's been a tailwind to our business all the way through. If you think on the supply side of compute, the Raspberry Pi 5, the product that our current flagship product that we launched a couple of years ago, it's about 150 times the performance of that product that we put out in 2012.
Wow.
What on the demand side, what is driving the need to have that much performance? Well, to a great degree, our largest OEM customers now, the people who are buying hundreds of thousands of Raspberry Pis a year, are almost all using that performance to run neural structured machine vision algorithms in order to make rapid autonomous decisions about the world around them. So I think it's very valuable.
So let's end with sort of coming full circle to the beginning. The purpose of this was to create talented, programming savvy, computer friendly, I guess, kids or students.
Yeah.
How do you assess your impact on that and your achievement of that vision?
Yeah. Well, I think we have a couple of good data points. So computer science by the nadir of the application curve in 2008, computer science had become at Alan Turing's university had become the easiest subject to get into with a 2-to-1 application ratio. Last year we had about 1,800 applicants for about 120 places. So we had a 15-to-1 application ratio. And the people applying to study computer science, most of them will have got their start with Raspberry Pi. When I hire a new engineer, we are a closed loop. We sometimes describe ourselves as a closed loop organization now, because when I hire a graduate engineer, they will have got their start on Raspberry Pi. I was having a conversation with somebody at Tesla the other day, and who use a lot of Raspberry Pis in their production process, who was saying that the one thing that all of their CSE graduate hires have in common is they've all used Raspberry Pis, right? So I think that there's really good evidence of impact. And it is just wonderful to meet these young people and to be able to deploy them, even as, 70-80% of our business is now industrial and embedded business, that we are still having enough impact. And the foundation, who, of course, we are not the Raspberry Pi Foundation. The Raspberry Pi Foundation, we paid about $50 million of dividends to the Raspberry Pi Foundation when we were a privately held company. The foundation sold about a third of its holdings in Raspberry Pi Limited at the IPO last year, raised another $180 million. So they're now extremely well capitalized, extremely capable, very well led charitable foundation delivering the Raspberry Pi mission in another way. We still believe that we deliver an important part of the Raspberry Pi Foundation, the Raspberry Pi mission, just by making the products. But they are training teachers, and they're running after school clubs, and they're producing material. So I think it's been a fantastic journey. It's been wonderful to just have that feeling that you can look at the world and perceive a problem and formulate a hypothesis about why the problem has happened and about what you might do to address it, and then go out and do it, and then see it happen.
Yeah.
It's been a wild experience, actually.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It must be incredibly gratifying, and it ain't over yet either.
Yeah,
So-
it's that's the important thing about the IPO. It's easy to see an IPO as some sort of capstone, but of course it isn't. It's a milestone, not a capstone.
Yeah. Well, Eben, thank you very much. This has been really wonderful. We're going to have to end now, even though we could talk, I think, for quite a bit longer. I'll just end with a little bit of a curiosity. About 2 hours ago, I'm here in Athens, Greece, and I was talking with the company that I'm associated with, called Yodec, and it turns out that they're not a small but not a big customer of Raspberry Pi, and I told them, and they were so excited that I was coming to meet you. Well, thank you very much, Eben Upton. This has been an amazing conversation. As you all know, this is Scale Up Podcasts, and I'm Dan Eisenberg. If we use Scale Up Podcasts as a platform to try and unravel the secrets and make them not secret anymore about how you grow companies that have impacts. And I think Raspberry Pi is just one phenomenal example of a company that has many different impacts, certainly on children, on education, on prosperity. And this is just another example. I won't say just another example. It's an amazing example, an outstanding example of what we're talking about here on this podcast. So thank you again, Eben, very much. It's been a wonderful conversation, and wishing you all the best, and we'll be watching.
Thank you very much.